Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning. That's my nice way of saying, come on now, let's get it. I'm trying to do it spiritually instead of saying, stop all that nonsense. Okay. But I am glad that it was a good question that you wanted to engage in. That's really good. Welcome. I am Josh, one of the pastors on staff. I am excited to be with you. I'm always excited to be with you, whether it's in the parking lot, whether it's in the front, whether it's here. I enjoy you guys. I couldn't always say that about church, but boy, I can't wait to get here. And so I'm just really thankful. If you're a guest, let me just say welcome. We really are glad you're with us today. Hopefully you will fill out that connection card so we can stay connected with you. But also let me catch you up on what's been going on. We've had 5 weeks of just, to me, amazingness. We had an amazing Easter. We've been in this amazing series. We had amazing Mother's Day. So I'm kind of hyped up. I got coffee and I'm excited. That's bad news for you. But I just want to say thank you to all the volunteers because you make church happen, and we've had a great run at it in the last month. And so, listen, we've been in the series, and this is the last week of the series called The Greatest Showman. And what we've done is we've looked at the movie or the musical The Greatest Showman, and we have taken out biblical concepts because there's biblical concepts all the way through the movie, and we have matched them up with scripture, and we have been teaching on it. Okay? And the bigger story is that P.T. Barnum who was kind of an outcast, who people didn't give him a second look, had this dream that he wanted to change the entertainment world. And eventually he gets the money to do it, and he takes these misfits, these people that nobody else wanted to talk to, nobody else thought were important, and they went off, and in 1870, I think it was 1 or 2, they started the circus. They changed the world. Now, what's crazy about this is, think about this with me. If it started in 1871, it just closed 2 years ago. Over 140 years. And what we've done is we've taken that and we said, you know, that's great. That's a great story, but there's a better story in the Bible of somebody taking misfits, and it's called Jesus and his disciples, and we are part of his disciples. And so we are excited about this because we are called to change the world too. And in week 1 on Easter, Alan talked about coming alive. There's a song, there's a scene that talks about coming alive. And he talked about Jesus coming to this earth, living in, our skin, understanding our whole experience, dying for us, and then beating death, coming back from the dead. And because he did that, you and I too can come from death to life. That we can come alive too. And instead of just being these living life and miserably living life, that we can live life and have life. And then week 2, we talked about This Is Me, which is another song, and it's actually another scene in the movie where P.T. Barnum is going around, he's talking to these misfits and saying, you're the person I need in order to make the show go. And they can't believe that he would need them because they have such a low view of themselves, because this is what society has been telling them. And what we did is we showed you, or we talked about how the disciples were these misfits too. We like to look at these disciples like they were just these super spiritual, right? These superheroes, spiritual superheroes, but we don't ever remember what they were like before God, before they walked with Jesus. And so we talked about that there was a guy on there who was a terrorist. We had some dudes who were racist. We had some dudes who were just greedy and backstabbing. And we had all sorts of, these 12 were misfits, miscreants. And God came into their life and said, I know where you began at. I see all this crazy, but if you follow me, I'm going to take you from where you began to what I want you to become. And that we too are these kind of spiritual Clark Kents, right? Where we start off and we look kind of weak, and where people are like, I don't know. But if we would just follow Jesus, he would turn us into something amazing that can change the world. And in week 3, we talked about never enough. That P.T. Barnum, in this one scene, he was just turning up. He had now become wealthy, and he was rubbing elbows with the rich and famous, and he was drinking champagne and, that champagne life, and he was doing it up. And he comes to this point where he realizes that none of this will ever fulfill him, that it's never enough. And the thing of it is I don't have a problem if we have some nice things. I don't have a problem with us doing some things. But when we put anything before God, it will never be enough. We will always find ourselves empty. And this week, what I really want to talk about is the last scene of the movie, and the actual title of the song for it is called From Now On. From Now On. And in this scene, P.T. Barnum comes to a point where he basically gained the world. He was wealthy, he had everything he wanted, and he started to realize, but he was losing his soul. Like in Mark 8, what does it profit a man to gain the world and lose his soul? And he realizes this, I'm losing my soul, and he has this what now moment. He really is, he doesn't say it, but he's having this question in his mind, what do I do now? And then the thing is when we have what now moments, they always, or a lot of times, lead to from now on decisions. And so he has a from now on decision based on a what now question in his life. And the truth is a lot of us have been at that what now moment. How many of you know we've been at what now moments in our life? What do I do now? Sometimes it's because things are going good. Sometimes it's because we make plans and we make goals and we reach them and it's going well. And we're like, okay, what now? How do I maintain? Sometimes it's because we reach goals and we've reached things that we want to do and we found that we are still miserable. And now we're saying that didn't work. What now? Sometimes we just turn up and it goes all sideways. And life is miserable. And we're like, I don't know what is going on. What now? And it's from those moments that we make from now on decisions, right? Think about this. I got this list here for you. Our marriage is not going well. And we're like, what now? Right? And if you have some people in your life who are good, they'll check you and tell you you've been tripping. Right? If you don't have yes men, but you have real people in your life, they'll be like, you've been tripping. And then you have this from now on, I need to be a better spouse. Right? What now? The doctor just told me that if I don't get it together, I may have a heart attack. And then we have a from now on moment, right? Like from now on, I got to eat a little better, got to do some exercise, something like that, right? What about when you have a broken relationship with the kid? Right? What now? They are tripping. Right? And especially with the grown kids, a lot of times there's this broken relationship because as parents, we have a hard time letting go. And then we have a realization, the kids have a realization when they're younger that they need to have a little more respect. They need to be a little more thankful. But as grown kids, we as adults have what now? I got to give them some space. What about at work when you have a boss who's crazy? And people go, yes, Lord, this is the one I needed him to talk about. You know, I'm that boss that you wake up in the middle of the night, I got to go to work tomorrow. You know what I'm saying? It wakes you up from good sleep. I got to go in tomorrow. The alarm clock goes off and you're like, no, because of that boss. And the thing is it's a what now moment, right? Am I going to have a conversation with that boss? Am I going to go in and act a nut up in that joint? Am I going to quit the job? But whatever the case is, you have a from now on moment from that, right? What about this? What about we've been living our lives for ourselves, how we want it, and we've just been turning up and turning up and turning up and doing what we want, and now we find ourselves miserable, broken, and empty, and it doesn't seem to be working out. And a lot of us had a what now, and our now what was I need to let Jesus be Lord of my life. We've all had these what now moments and then had to make, from now on decisions. And today I want to talk about that last one. When we make that decision to follow Jesus, and there's two things I want to do. If you have not made that decision, I want to lay out an argument for you to make that decision today. For you to say from now on, he's the Lord of my life. But if you've made that decision, I want to talk about how do we do from now on, I am his people and he is my God, because it's hard. How many know that? I mean, it's hard. People test it out every day on you, right? And don't let them find out that you are saved, because it seems like they test you even harder to see if you're real. And so then it's like, I said from now on, but I feel like punching out and give me 2 minutes, Lord. So that's what I want to talk about. And what's great for us is we get to look at in the Bible, the Israelites had quite a few moments like this, but the real big one they had can be found in Joshua 24. They had this really huge from now on moment. And Joshua, it's the last chapter of the book of Joshua. Joshua slows down and says, this is my last opportunity to speak to you. And I got 3 steps that you need to do in order to live into, from now on, he's the Lord of my life. And so Joshua slows down and starts talking about stuff. So we're going to look at that. And we're going to answer 2 questions. The first question is simply this: how did the Israelites live for God daily? So they had this from now on moment, and then how did they live into it? And Joshua gives them 3 things they need to do. And then from hearing about that story, how can we live for God daily? Because it's not easy. So let's just take a moment and pray, and then we can jump in. Father, we need you today. Holy Spirit, we need you today. I just pray that you would begin to minister to each one of us, that you would begin to help us come to a point where we see where we're at. Do we need to make a from now on commitment to you? And if we have, how's that going? And what do we need to do to make sure that we're living it out? Because ultimately you have caused us, you have told us, you desire us to change the world. And if we're going to do it, we have to live into the from now on, I will serve the Lord. You are my God, and I'm your people. So help us today as we look at your word. In Jesus' name, amen. So let me give you a little context before I give you the first statement, the first question, the first answer. You have to understand that they had been in the promised land in Joshua 24. They were at the end of this whole 700-year promise. I want you to understand that, because some of us, we get a promise and somebody hasn't kept it in 2 weeks and we're ready to do some damage to some folks. Somebody owes us money from a month ago and we're ready to go, put a lien on their house to tell them to take out a second mortgage because they didn't keep their promise, right? These people are living into a 700-year promise. And now they're sitting here and Joshua's about to speak to them, and that promise has come to fruition. And you have to understand that God told Abraham way back when, this is what I'm going to do. You're going to be a father of many nations, and I'm going to give you this land. And then they found themselves about 300 years after Abraham going into Egypt, right? And they went into Egypt because God was providing from them during the famine. And then somehow in the middle of that, for about 430 years, they found themselves enslaved to the Egyptians. And then they are delivered from that, and Moses leads them out, and we're going to talk about some of the other stuff. But they get into this promised land, and then they see giants. They see they see this wall of Jericho. And God allows them to beat all that. And now they're standing at the end of that moment. And Joshua says to them, this is a from now on moment, because right now we're all asking, what now? The 700-year promise has been fulfilled. God has been good to us. Now what? Well, let me tell you. And this is where Joshua steps in and starts to answer this first question of how did the Israelites live for God daily? And the first way is Joshua told them, you got to remember what your life was like before God. Now, that doesn't seem like a big deal. But Joshua said, you got to remember what life was before God. And let me read it for you. It says in verse 2 of 24, it says, Joshua said to all the people, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel says. So he's saying, I am God's mouthpiece right now. God is speaking through me. Long ago, your ancestors in Terah and the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond Euphrates River, and they worshiped other gods. So Joshua starts out and said, you got to remember that before God, you had some other gods, that you were doing some other stuff that wasn't what God would want you to do. And that doesn't seem like a big deal. But the thing is we, for some reason as humans, one of our biggest problems is we don't remember well. And so we repeat stuff. And so Josh says, let me slow down here and let's talk about this. You had false gods, and it wasn't good for you back then. You were worshiping these other gods, and it was not good for you. You were turning up, and it didn't work out for you. And you need to remember that. And the thing is we, before we knew Jesus, we were doing the same thing. And I know in today's society, we don't like to believe we have false gods, because we like to think it's like some kind of like wooden statue that you're worshiping or golden statue. But the truth is before we followed Jesus, we were worshiping false gods too. Look, people quiet, don't talk to me like that. You remember that false god of materialism? Ooh, I used to look sharper than a mug. I used to think I was the man. Whoo, I thought I was sharp. Don't even look at me, you might get cut. I'm sharp. Don't even know. You remember that God of entertainment? You remember that God of pleasure? You remember that? And what's so crazy is back in that time of my life, I had no problem worshiping those gods. Matter of fact, when I first got saved, I had a major problem. It took me a while to really grasp the concept of tithing. I was like, why am I going to give my money? It's my money. I did all this other nonsense. But you know what's so crazy is I never had a problem tithing to the God of pleasure. I would spend half of my check to step up in that club or something like that. Y'all know what I'm talking about? I'll be tithing like, yes, never complain. No, you don't need 10, you need 50% of this check. See, now y'all know what I'm talking about. You were doing it too. Tithing like a mug and never complain. You remember that Friday night worship service? With the communion cup, with the umbrella? And the worship music, you was like, yeah. Oh, y'all don't remember that? You don't remember that false god? How many know it's getting real in here right now? What's so funny is I'm saying this, is we all do remember that. But we don't remember it well. We do remember the turn up. We do remember that we were turning up. We do. We wouldn't say we were worshiping false gods. We wouldn't say we were tithing to entertainment. But we remember turning up, acting out. We do remember, but we don't remember it well. And that is what Josh was saying, is like, you need to know that you were serving a false god, that you were turning up. But then you need to know what the outcome of that was. See, we forget the outcome of turning up. Right? We remember it fondly too, don't we? If I could just go back to that. Those were great moments in my life. We remember the party, but forget the scary pregnancy test afterwards. Both the guy and girl like, oh, we forget about that, right? Oh, we remember the drinking, but we don't remember being jailed. That we got pulled over, thrown in jail for drunk driving, lost our car, had to pay some fines. You see what I'm saying? We have this selective memory. We remember hooking up, doing what we want, when we want, with whoever we want, but we don't remember being hurt up. Selective memory. Selective memory. It's so funny because in Exodus 16, the Israelites have been taken out. They've been delivered from slavery. They had crossed across the Red Sea. And you know what they were saying? If we could just go back to the good old days. You mean the days when you had chains on? Those days? The days when you were spending 16, 18 hours building bricks? Those days? See, it's selective memory. They remember turning up, but they don't remember their whole life being turned inside out. You see, I has turned out. Some of y'all right now got some bad thoughts going through your head because when you used to turn up, I already know. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the devil will turn your life inside out. That false god will have you sitting on your steps in the morning wondering, what is going on with my life? Why am I so empty? Why am I so hurt? Josh was saying, remember that. Remember. Not just to turn up, but how you got turned all the way out, how you were miserable, how you were broken, how you were weeping. Remember what your life was like before God. See, in this song, from now on, P.T. Barnum actually says this. He basically is saying, I was turning up. I was champagning out. You know, that champagne life. I was doing my thing. And then look what he says. Look at these things. He says, then the sun began to dim. It ain't bright no more. Then he says, and winter's wind began to blow. Well, I was running around some shorts, but now it's getting real cold up in this mug. And then look what he says. The walls of fame began to turn into rubble. He's saying that I was turning up and it seemed so good, and then my life was turned inside out. And I have forgotten. And he's saying, I need to remember this. We need to remember. Joshua's telling them, remember your life before God. And don't just remember the turn up. Remember your life before God. Remember the brokenness. Remember the emptiness. Remember sitting there not wondering, not knowing if you even had purpose in your life. Remember this. Very important. And so, and Joshua's really saying, I know you had these moments of pleasure, but they turned into mountains of pain. How many know that is so true? That living the sinful life, you get a glimpse of pleasure, you get a moment of pleasure, but afterwards there's a mountain of pain, a mountain of emptiness. Joshua is saying, if you are daily going to live for God, that you need to remember your life without God. Remember what it was like before you had him. But then he goes on after that, and he's still talking about memory. He said, remember your life without God. And then he said, the second thing, in order to live this kind of from now on, he's my God and I am his people. Joshua basically says that you need to daily remember your life with God. So remember what it was like without him, and now let's remember what it was like with him. Literally, if in science, I was a science teacher, I would have my kids right now make a T-chart. I'd have them make a T-chart, and I'd say before Christ, after Christ. And then we'd list out, this is really what Joshua was doing. He's listing out all this crazy stuff that happened, all the brokenness before Christ. And now I say, now let's look at life with Christ. And he says 5 or 6 things. And so I have just 5. The whole chapter is long, so I just took snippets of what Joshua was saying. So let me read some of them to you that speak to remembering your life with Christ. In verse 3, he says, but I took your father Abraham out from the land beyond the Euphrates and led him through Canaan and gave him many descendants. I gave him Isaac. He's saying 2 things here. He's saying, first of all, Abraham's fathers were worshiping idols, and I removed Abraham from him. I provided, I moved him. I took him from that scenario. I was helping Abraham. And then I not only moved him, but Abraham and Isaac were Abraham and Sarah were really old, and they couldn't see that they could have kids. And God was like, I'm going to provide. I'm going to give you kids, and I'm going to make you a father of many nations. He's saying, remember that? That was with God. Let's write that down in that ledger. God provided a way out from all this nonsense. God provided when it didn't seem like there was any way that they could have kids. Then he goes on and says this. Then I sent Moses and Aaron, and I afflicted the Egyptians by what I did there and brought you out. So there's 2 things that go into this too. First of all, God took them into Egypt to keep them from the famine. Remember, he's really saying, remember that? Remember how you were on starving's door? And God said, no, I'm going to hook you up. I want to make another nation take you in and feed you. But then you remember how they turned on you and how you spent 430 something years in slavery. And you remember all those years you were calling out, if you just would help me out. Remember that? And for some of us, we were calling out, Lord, if you just give me a spouse. And now we like, man, I can't stand being around him. You know. Let me stop right there and move on. And then he says, but they cried out in verse 7a, but they cried out to the Lord for help, and he put darkness between you and the Egyptians. He brought the sea over them and covered them up. He said, remember when you got to the Red Sea and there seemed no way forward? It was impossible, and you saw your enemies at your back. You remember that? But see, do you remember you were with God, so God made a way out of no way? You remember that? How many of you remember situations in your life where there was no way and God made a way? How many of you remember situations when your enemies were at your back and you knew you wanted to do something crazy, but you're like, but nope, I'm going to let God. And then you watch the water fall on them. You're like, and you know you didn't do right. You know you weren't like, oh, God, help them. Don't let them drown. You're like, ha, 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 ha. You know you were on, you know you weren't spiritual at all about it. Let's be real. He's saying, you remember that? Check this out. He doesn't stop there. He is like, do you remember? Then you lived in the wilderness for a long time. For 40 years, you lived in the wilderness, and there wasn't no, Alan likes to say J.C. Penney. Like, I got this from J.C. Penney. Like, it sounds real, There wasn't any, J.C. Penney's. There wasn't any shoe store. So guess what? those same clothes you had on when you went into that wilderness were still looking so fresh and clean when you walked out. Those same, well, they didn't have Michael Jordans, but can you imagine having those 1984 Jordans on, that first pair? And you just walking for 40 years and them things look like they just came out of the box. Can you imagine not having food, but every morning God dropping food from the sky? He's saying, do you remember your life with God? He ain't done though, because he's he wants to fill this column way out. In verse 13, he says this is God speaking. So I gave you the land which you did not toil on. I want to stop there for a moment. I gave you farms that are all the way built out and you didn't do a day's work on them. That's what I'm talking about. I ain't here to do no work and it's just ready to be harvested. That's what I'm talking about. The land which you did not toil on. I gave you cities you didn't build. You didn't put one nail into that city, and yet I gave it to you. Wow. Then he goes on, he says, and you live in them, and you eat from the vineyards and the olive groves that you did not plant. Do you remember how you didn't have a land? And you got to understand, back then, a land meant an identity, and it meant we were a nation, and that we were able to provide, and that we had a place to call. And he said, remember when you had nothing, you were nobodies, and do you remember this? I didn't just give you barren land. I had other people build it out, and then I gave it to you. Do you remember? See, I can't remember that without remembering what it was like before God, though. I'm gonna be honest with you. I cannot remember how good it was with God unless I remember how bad it was without him. And that's why he started out the way he does. And a lot of times because we don't remember how bad it was before we had God, we can't remember how good it is now. Right? We don't remember how bad it was when we were single and we were spending hours fasting and praying. And so now we're married and we're like, you think I'm playing? Look, as a pastor, I do marriage counseling. All the time. I do pre-marriage counseling, post-marriage counseling. And people just like, I'm just so glad you are just the butter on my bread and I can't wait to get married to you. I'm like, really? You gonna remember this 5 years in? No. You gonna remember that you said, I can't believe it's not butter then? Is you gonna remember that? You gonna remember it 5? You know we forget, you hear me? But we didn't remember how bad it was without that person, so we act like it's really not that good when it is good with this person. And it's how we do with almost everything, but especially in our relationship with God. And Joshua's laying it out. Joshua's saying, do you remember how messed up you were, but how much mercy you were given? Do you remember that you were literally in chains and we were chains to sin, and that he freed you? Do you remember how that dangerous situation and he protected you? Do you remember when there was no way out, but he made a way out? Do you remember when your enemies were at your back and he took care of them? Do you remember that? Do you remember when you didn't have anything and he provided manna for you? Do you remember it? Do you remember when you felt like there was no way, that the walls were too big to climb, but he took Jericho's walls down? Do you remember when the battle seemed to not be able to be won because there was not enough time, but I lifted up Joshua's hands and time stood still into the battle? Do you remember that kind of stuff in your life? Man, we forget. We forget. How easily we forget. And Joshua is saying, if you were going to have this from now on moment, you have to remember how jacked up it was before God, when you were turning up and how your life was getting turned out, inside out. And then you got to remember how good God was to you. It's so interesting because Moses' last speech to the people before Joshua took over, let me just read it. It's not up there, but let me read it. It's in Deuteronomy 6:12. This is what Moses says to the people. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord. Do not forget that you were in Egypt. Do not forget that he has pulled us out. Moses is saying, you know what our biggest problem is as people of God is we forget. And you know what Joshua's saying now, the leader after Moses? Our biggest problem to living from now on is that we forget how bad it was when we were turning up. We forget that the devil turned our lives inside out. And then because of that, we don't remember that God showed up and turned our lives around. Listen to that. We turned up, we got turned out, he showed up and turned it around. Wow. Wow. You know, the Israelites, what they started to do, because they were forgetful people, and we are too, is they started to have festivals and feasts. And all of if you ever look, there's all these festivals and feasts that they have. They're all about remembering. Their whole yearly calendar has all these different celebrations in it so that they don't forget. Isn't that powerful? Here's the other thing. In Joshua 3, after they crossed Euphrates, Joshua was so amazed and he was so excited. It's like, we got to build a monument. So what the Israelites used to do is, as they were traveling and God was providing, they used to build these things called stone monuments or Ebenezers. And they really were monuments of remembrance. They would build these structures, rock upon rock. So every time they came across it, they say, oh yeah, God did that for us. I need to remember. And I know you've been wondering what's in my bucket here today, but my family was able to do this when my father-in-law, when Alicia's dad passed. We all took a rock. We took these rocks so that we could remember him. And we wrote scriptures on it that made us think about him. Think about that. It's just powerful. And every time I look at these, it's amazing. Colossians 3:23 and 4. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working unto the Lord and not to men. My father-in-law worked like that. Micah 6:8. And I'm not going to read all of them, but I want you to. He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, love mercy. My father-in-law loved mercy. I'm getting a little emotional, but just work with me. James 3:18, peacemakers who saw in peace raised the harvest of righteousness. That my father was a father-in-law, loved to bring peace to complicated situations. This is Matthew 28 about the Great Commission, because every time we would go somewhere, I'd be ready to move on, and he wanted to talk to somebody about Jesus. You see, we need to remember. This is just a man that we're remembering, a very precious man to me. But we need to remember God. After Joshua talks about remembering what your life was like before God, and then what your life, how great it's been with God, he then goes on to the third step in order for us to have this from now on moment. And he basically is saying this: you must daily live for God. You need to make a choice. You need to make a choice for God. Look at what he says towards the end of this chapter. But if serving the Lord seems desirable for you, that's an understatement. You know he just laid out this T-chart. Bad, 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 bad. Wrecked life. Right? All this stuff. And then he said, good, provision, love, pursuit, looking out for you, making a way when there is no way, taking care of your enemies. He lays out this thing. He says, if it's desirable for you. Really? Is anybody in here questioning how desirable it is to have God in your life? After that list? He says, hey, if it's desirable, if it seems desirable for you, then choose for yourself this day whom you will serve. He's saying, look, so far you've just been following me and the leaders, but it's time for you to make some personal decisions in your everyday life and with your family about who you're going to follow. Whether the gods of your ancestors, whether you'll go back to turn up and getting your life turned out. Whether the God of your ancestors served behind the Euphrates or the God of the Ammonites in whose lands you were living. But as for me and my household, we always hear this scripture, we will serve the Lord. Joshua is saying, I made this list for you. Now you got to choose. Nobody else is going to choose for you. Your pastor's not going to choose for you. Your leader's not going to choose for you. You have to make a personal decision, and it really needs to be a daily decision. You know, it's interesting as a pastor, one of my favorite things, I was talking about marriage counseling. I love marriage counseling. Let me tell you why. I love meeting with couples before they get married because we talk about stuff and I help them think through. They talk about stuff they didn't even think they needed to talk about. You know how you're just in love and you're like, it'll all work out because of love? It's like, no, slow down. That sounds good, but let's have a conversation. Because when Pookie and them drain your fund, it ain't, that love ran out when that money ran out. I'm just, we need to have a conversation about how you deal with money. You know what I'm saying? But one of the things that I talk to, no matter whether it's pre-marriage counseling or post-marriage counseling, one of the things that I have a conversation with them about is that just because you say I do on that day doesn't mean you're going to have a good marriage. That I do was not just a one-moment situation. Yes, you are now married because the pastor or the minister got you up here and it was grand and she had a nice dress on and the music was great and, all the ladies had these phenomenal dresses on and guys were tuxed out. And truthfully, that was like when we first said yes to I do to God. But the truth is if you're not going to say I do every day after that, if you're not going to say I do when it gets hard, if you're not going to say I do when you have to give up something, if you're not going to say I do when you see that you might not think you're wrong, but it's hurting your partner. You see, that's what Joshua is saying here, is I know you are the children of God. I know you had the marriage ceremony, but what you're going to do from now on? What you're going to do every day when you have these I do moments? Are you going to choose to serve God? He's been real good. There's no reason why you shouldn't do this if you remember what you're going to do. What you're going to do when your boss is tripping at work. You going to say I do to God? Or are you going to say I don't and go curse him out? Huh? What you going to do when you know that the only thing you've come to your ends with your child and the only possible solution is choking that fool straight out? Doing some WWE on that child. Some hands-on loving. You gonna show them Christ then? You know all y'all like, I don't. I'm checking out right there. You hear what I'm saying to you? Remember what your life was before. God, it was jacked up. And you were worshiping a false God like I was. Remember how good it got when you got God. And start saying I do to God every day. This can't be a once-in-a-lifetime decision. Choose today whom you will serve. Daily living for God means we have to daily choose God. This leads me to my last question, and I want to ask the volunteers and band members to start moving to where you need to be because it's only going to be a few more minutes. So how do we daily live for God? And I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I want to go back to what we just talked about. I want to go back to remembering. Are we remembering? Do you remember what your life was when you were worshiping that false God? And sometimes that false God is me, myself, and I. Right? Do you remember that? We need to remember, and I'm going to challenge you to write down how jacked up it was. Write it down on a piece of paper. Man, it was jacked up. I can remember this. I can remember how I would cry out to God. I want you to write it down just like Joshua laid it out. And do you remember the amazing feeling when you met Jesus? Do you remember the amazing feeling when you seen that he had your back, when he provided for you, when he protected you? Write down some of those. I'm going to tell you, almost every morning, one of the things that I always think about is I had this amazing guy come into my life. My father wasn't around, and so Alex came into my life. And really, I should be a statistic. I have no doubt how jacked up my life was as a kid and all the dumb stuff I did. I should be a statistic. But God sent Alex into my life. And I almost on a daily basis just stopped and have to say, God could have had Alex reach into somebody else's life. Why me? You've been good to me, Lord. That was a pivotal point. Why did you put me in a home where my mom was a praying mom? Why, Lord? That's pivotal. Why? I'm so thankful. I know it was a hard life. We didn't have a lot. There was times we didn't have anything. We lived in crazy neighborhoods with drug houses and stuff. There was times when I didn't want to live, but after being saved, I look back at my life before Christ and then with him. And I even see how he moved in my life before I even came to him. And I remember, and I know how good I got it. It makes it easier for me to choose him every morning. I want you to remember, write down some things, and you look at that list every morning. You build your Ebenezer's on a piece of paper, and you thank him for it, because it's going to make the next thing you need to do, which is to choose him every day, easy. If I see the list of how crazy it was when I was turning up and how my life got turned all the way inside out, and then I see the list of how he showed up and turned around, it's not a hard decision to make every morning to choose him. To choose him. He's choosing you. Alicia told me the story of this girl this week, and I don't want to get into too much of it because some of it's confidential, but basically this girl's life, she had been raped. She basically lost both parents. And it brought me back to my childhood and I was not raped and I didn't lose both my parents, but I remember some of the hardship in my life. And I'm going to tell you what got me through. It was those people who made a choice, who said, from now on, I am going to serve the Lord. You know, my mom made a commitment, and we used to do these daily devotions, and she'd pray for us. My mom made a commitment from now on, and that from now on from my mom changed my life. Alex made a commitment that he would come into the hood and live in the hood, and that he would take hood kids, and he made a from now on decision that affected that I'm standing here today. See, your from now on moments don't just affect you. We've been talking about that God has called you to change the world. Can you imagine all the people who made from now on moments who spoke into my life, and now I'm sitting here preaching to you now that they changed the world? From now on. You don't even know who it's going to impact and what God's going to do with them. But I can promise you this, if you don't say from now on, it won't happen. Remember your life without Christ. Remember how good he's been to you since you've had him. And choose from now on every morning. I need you to close your eyes with me. And I want to speak to those who've never, ever made a commitment to Jesus Christ. You've never, ever asked him to be Lord of your life. I'm telling you right now that you have a list before Christ, and I can promise you it's an empty list. It's a list of being broken. It's a list of emptiness. It's a list of 5 minutes of pleasure and mountains of pain and brokenness. And I'm saying to you right now, there's another list for you though. It's with Christ. I'm saying to you right now that he'll make a way, that he will provide, that he will protect, that he does pursue you, that he does love you. And you need to make that commitment today. And so if you're in here and you know, I need to make this from now on, I will serve the Lord, I want you to pray with me right now. Jesus, I see the moment of pleasure and the mountain of pain in my life right now. I see my life without you. But I heard this list of life with you, and I want it. And so I'm asking you to come into my life and be Lord of my life. I am telling you, like Joshua said, I am choosing to serve you. For me and my household, we will serve, we will follow the Lord from now on. And Lord, for the rest of us, help us to remember. Help us to remember what it was like without you so we can remember how good it is with you. And help us to understand that you are taking us as misfits and turning us into spiritual superheroes, and that when we say from now on, we impact people's lives, we impact the world. Help us to choose to say from now on, every morning, in Jesus' name.